This is the problem with horror movies. Everyone knows what's coming next, but actions have momentum. Every decision an equal and justified reaction. Just because you know you should doesn't mean that you can stop. Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Cassandra Khaw's book, Nothing But Blackened Teeth. So this is a Japanese-inspired horror novel. There's some really interesting stuff in this, and one of the things that I think is most interesting is the way in which Khaw is continually evoking the tropes of horror movies, the order in which people die, the way that particular symbols reflect on what's about to happen. This idea that that fate derives the logic of horror movies. And so that's why I started with that quote. But there is this meta element throughout this novel. The character Lynn, for instance, is the one who's sort of continually coming back to this idea. So the narrator, Kat, and Lynn are the two sort of outsider characters. I'll give you enough sort of plot summary that this will make a little bit more sense. So basically, this group of friends, Lynn, Phillip, Talia, and Lynn, have come to this decrepit, haunted mansion in Japan for Fi's and Talia's wedding. This group had all been sort of ghost hunters earlier on, but then some various things occurred. Kat, we learn, had various psychological issues, attempted suicide, was in a mental institution for a while. Phillip, who's this sort of WASP jock, wealthy, all-American type dude. He is sort of in that weird space where he's still kind of like frat boy partying, but he's also just got a lot of money. He is in this sort of weird space where he is clearly a professional who's making professional money, but he's also still in this oh, I'm young and free kind of space. Fi's and Kat had briefly dated, and so Talia is not really a fan of Kat. There was also some interpersonal conflict where Kat apparently tried to break them up because it seemed like the relationship between Talia and Fi's wasn't going well. So there's a lot of tension, and that's actually really that's one of the things about this book. The first, I'd say slightly over half of the book, really up through chapter 6, which begins on page 81 in a 120-page book. So I guess more like the first maybe 2/3 of this book is much more focused on the interpersonal conflicts between these characters, and Kat trying to sort of come to terms with this situation that she's found herself in. And then the last third or so of the book just really gets nuts with supernatural stuff going on. So there's a weird balance. But one of the things is, because this is a group that did ghost hunting and did these sort of haunted house tours and things like this, that's why they're in this mansion in the first place, is this was Philip's sort of attempt to be let's have a really expensive but amazing sort of pre-wedding celebration for Fi's and Talia. But because this is a group that is very familiar with these sort of tropes of ghost hunting and the way that these things work, when things start to get spooky, Lynn keeps coming back to this almost like a refrain of now is when people start dying. And he talks about this, and then Kat sort of repeats this idea later on in the narrative dialogue here. So Lynn says, Kat, this is literally the part where the supporting cast dies horribly. You're bisexual, I'm the comic relief, it's going to be one of us. Kat says, but, and he cuts her off. He says, Phillip's white, he'll be fine. Wise is the hero, so he won't die in the first fucking act. And Talia, well, maybe Talia's thoroughly fucked, but I don't care about her. So this idea of, like, we know horror. We know what happens. We've got enough slasher flicks. We've got enough horror movies. We know the order in which people die. We know why particular people die and why particular people live. And Khaw's coming back to that continually, which is what makes it really, really ironic what actually happens, who survives and who doesn't survive. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but there is a lot of signaling done throughout this novel that, hey, this is the world of horror, you know what's going to happen, you know who's going to die. But who dies and how they die is not what all of that signaling points us toward. So I think that's a really interesting technique. I think it works really, really well, because not only does it assume that readers of a horror novel will have certain expectations of this genre, it directly points us to those expectations and then subverts them in a really interesting way. So I think that's really, really cool. I like that technique a lot. It's a kind of a bait and switch almost, but I think it works really well. One of the other things that we have in this novel that I think is another sort of horror trope is we have the unreliable narrator. That question of madness. And this is maybe less in terms of like slasher flicks and more in terms of something like Lovecraft and cosmic horror or something like this, where Kat she has these psychological issues. She has attempted suicide, she's been in a mental institution, etc., etc., and we learn that about her fairly on. We also continually get this sort of sense that she is experiencing spooky stuff in this house before anybody else does. So, like, she is the first one to see this bride. I can't remember the Japanese term, which I probably will not be able to pronounce properly anyway. I will find it in just a second. Ohaguro Batari. It's probably not pronounced right, but basically, the legend of this mansion is that there was a woman who was getting married. Her husband abandoned her, and basically out of shame and love for him, she had herself buried in the house while still alive, and then the family buried another girl every year as this sort of weird sacrifice to appease her spirit, basically. And Kat is the first one who sees this character. But it's not clear whether she's actually seeing this character or whether she's actually seeing this this spirit, or whether this is just her mind playing tricks on her. So we get this bit where she says, where Kat, the narrator, says, I stared into the brass, and there she was, Jesus fuck, standing behind me, chin braced against my shoulder, arms laced around my waist, fingers snarled in my shirt, their grip possessive. She was so close, yet somehow I couldn't make out her face. No, that wasn't right. My vision was just fine. It was my brain. My brain wouldn't inventory its observations, would not process and sustain any memory of her face, retain anything but the red of her rosebud mouth, the lacquered black of her hair. Her hands moved, her fingers sunk into the grooves between my ribs, squeezed. I gasped at the pressure, and in answer she made animal noises, soothing and sweet. The light plunged through the gap between her lips, and there was only ink and the smell of vinegar, only black teeth. Then she's interrupted. We have, in quotation marks, cat, with a question mark. That vision, that experience of being sort of embraced by this spectral bride dissipates. And it's not clear at all that Talia, who has just sort of addressed her, saw this thing. So, especially when when we get these two lines, my vision was just fine, it was my brain. It raises these questions about narrative reliability. So we've got all this sort of trope of whether or not this is a reliable narrator, whether or not she is insane, whether or not she's experiencing maybe these paranoid delusions or something like this. And that's striking. That's really important because, again, in the first 2/3 or so of the book, sometimes there's things that other people in the group find creepy, but we don't really have any sort of external validation of the anxieties that Kat is having. So I think that's really interesting. There's a couple of other things that I think are really cool here. One is I really like Khaw's prose style. I think it's really, really good. I think she's got these just amazing phrases and these startling images. So I like this one, for instance. I marked this just because I like the style. So she's talking about when they've first gone into this house, and Kat is sort of assessing the house initially. And Khaw says here, in Kat's voice, the sight of it itched under my skin, like someone had fed those small black picnic ants through a vein somehow, got them to spread out under the thin layer of dermis, got them to start digging. I love that image. So that's one of the things that I think is really powerful about this book, is the prose style is so good and so unique. There's another element that I think is really cool that we get, especially toward the end, which is this sort of transcorporeality of Kat's experience, particularly her experience with death when one of the other characters is dying, and I won't tell you who because I don't want to spoil it. But so I'm going to replace that character's name with just a pronoun. But this sort of idea, so transcorporeality is this idea developed, at least in part, through eco-criticism. And the idea is that we as beings, we as physical beings, are interpenetrated by things in the environment, by things around us, that, for instance, when we consume something, when we eat or drink or breathe in something, that becomes a part of us. And so this idea of the transcorporeality of the experience of death, of someone's death, is a really interesting thing. So we've got here this line, I didn't know someone else's pain could have a texture, a bite, a gelatinousness you could hold in your teeth, that I could almost gnaw on his dying. And then a couple pages later, I ran a hand through my hair, swallowed again, but the reek of his insides persisted, a sour caul gloving my tongue, the back of my mouth tasting muddily of coins. So the visceral physicalness of this character's death is being evoked here, is being experienced here, not just on the level of sight or smell or even the sort of taste of a scent, but in this very physical way. And that's a really interesting way of creating an intensity to this experience.